Hi everyone, I'm your host Roxanne, and today we're going to be diving into the wild story of a guy from big old Texas, Christopher Duntsch. So who is Christopher Duntsch? Well, he was a neurosurgeon. Fancy resume, pristine white coat, the whole promise of brilliance vibe. But underneath all that polish, his hands, well, they left a devastating trail of destruction. Seriously, his story shocked the entire medical community and even changed the way hospitals and the law think about dangerous doctors. But how did this guy get there, right? How does someone start off so ambitious, he was a dream-chasing young doctor, and somehow he becomes a literal nightmare in the operating room? Let's rewind and start at the very beginning. All right, so a little background on Christopher Duntsch, or full name Christopher Daniel Duntsch. He was born on April 3rd, 1971 in Montana, but most of his childhood was spent in a quiet suburb in Memphis, Tennessee. He was the oldest of 4 kids, 2 brothers and a sister. He grew up in what seemed like a totally normal household. His dad, Donald, was a physical therapist and a Christian missionary, and his mom, Susan, was a school teacher. From very early on, Christopher was, determined, if you will, laser focused. If he set his mind to something, nothing was going to stop him from achieving that. The first time that this really showed was in high school when he threw himself into football. He went to Christian school, in Memphis, and he worked tirelessly to try to become this star player. He wasn't the most naturally gifted athlete, but he really did outwork almost everyone else. Teammates really remember him as someone who would never take no. You could not tell this guy no. If he told he wasn't good enough, he doubled down and he trained harder and he pushed himself into the point of exhaustion just to prove them all wrong. That kind of determination ended up landing him a football scholarship to Millsaps College in Mississippi. But then things kind of took a shift. He transferred to Colorado State University. I couldn't figure out the reason why, and he tried to walk on as a linebacker. He trained like crazy at this point, but let's be honest, he just didn't have the natural talent to go pro. And then I'm assuming homesickness hit, right? After just 1 year, he left Colorado and he went back to Tennessee, where he enrolled in Memphis State University, which is now known as the University of Memphis. He wanted to pick up football again, obviously, but transfer rules, they pretty much killed that dream, taking away his eligibility. So just like that, his football career was officially over. So football didn't work out, but did that stop him? Not even close. Instead, it pushed him in a totally different direction, one that's even bigger and even more ambitious. Duntsch decided he was going to go into medicine. If he couldn't be a star on the field, he was going to be a star in operating room. And he didn't just want to become any doctor. He wanted to become a neurosurgeon, which, to be very frank, is one of the hardest and most prestigious fields out there. He threw himself into his studies. He earned himself his undergraduate degree in 1995, but that wasn't enough for him, obviously, and it wasn't enough for the medical field. Duntsch wasn't just going to be any doctor. He was going to be extraordinary. He enrolled in a tough MD PhD program at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. He worked towards both a medical degree and a doctorate in neuroscience. He even got into, bear with me here because this is a mouthful, he even got into the elite Alpha Omega Alpha Medical Honor Society. Try saying that 10 times, which only takes about the top 12% of students. So basically, he was stacking up accomplishments like it was nobody's business. Now, on paper, this man, he looked unstoppable, really. Brilliant, driven, and a future superstar neurosurgeon. But here's the thing. Behind all of the awards and degrees, cracks were already forming. And we're not talking little cracks. These were the kind that would eventually grow into some seriously dangerous holes. Duntsch's surgical residency at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center, it actually started off looking pretty promising. He focused on research, which ended up earning him a respected role as the program director of the school's tissue bank. He oversaw 2 research labs, and he got to work alongside some really big names in stem cell research. On paper, it was really impressive, right? But as we'll see, this phase of his career also revealed red flags, like redder than my lipstick. Here's the thing. While most of his colleagues were getting tons of hands-on experience in the OR or operating room, Duntsch spent the majority of his time in the lab, chasing grants and trying to find patents. By the time he finished his 6-year residency, he had participated in fewer than 100 surgeries. Fewer than 100. Most neurosurgery residents do over 1,000 before graduating. Not great, yikes. And it didn't stop there. He co-founded a biotech company called Dysgenics. It focused on stem cell research and stem cell treatments for spinal injuries, right? It sounds impressive, but conflicts quickly popped up. His collaborators, Valery Kukakov and Tatiana Ignatova, I apologize if I'm butchering those names, I'm really trying here. They accused him of taking credit for their discoveries, methods that they pioneered for culturing stem cells outside of the human body. And when Duntsch filed these patents, their names were either misspelled or left out completely. Kukakov later said, quote unquote, "It wasn't his invention. It was the invention of me and my wife because we made all the primary experiments." Another company he started, it was called Novostem Therapeutics. It collapsed after the 2008 financial crisis, leaving him in really big debt. Investors ended up bailing, and Duntsch was really scrambling for money at this point. Meanwhile, his personal life was messy. Reports surfaced of heavy use, LSD, Coca-Cola, prescription. One story from a deposition is pretty wild. Megan Kane, she at the time was dating Duntsch's childhood friend named Jerry Summers, who will come into this story later. She recalled that for his birthday, he took a cocktail of LSD and pain medication and Coca-Cola all night. And then he went straight to work the very next day. Her exact words for this were, "I thought it was pretty amazing that he was even able to go to work. He wasn't paranoid, and he didn't not want to. He was totally fine going to work." I don't think she means, yeah, he was good to go. I think she meant he was totally okay with the situation, that he had taken all of these things the night before, partied hard, and then still wanted to go to work. That is insane. An anonymous tip led to an investigation, but instead of expulsion, the university sent him to a rehab program for impaired physicians. This was something entirely new I learned. I didn't know that this was a thing, but yeah, doing my research, I learned a lot about this case and a lot about medical field in general. Not necessarily operating room, because I am not a surgeon or an MD or hold any of those titles, but more so about the medical community and what goes on behind the scenes. So once he finished this program, he was allowed to resume his residency. And by the time he was nearing the end of his training, he was really in deep financial trouble. He reportedly owed over $500,000, and he was desperate for stability. I would be too. Don't get me wrong. I think any of us would be, or majority of us would be. Desperate for stability, he met Wendy Renee Young. Met her at a bar in Memphis. Their romance moved really fast. They were living together within 3 months, and soon she became pregnant. And because bills were piling up and he now has a new family on the way, Duntsch started applying for surgical positions. On paper, he looked perfect. I'm talking MD, PhD, impressive research experience, except he lied about graduating magna cum laude from St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital with a doctorate in microbiology. There wasn't even a program like that at the time. But despite that, hospitals were impressed, and he received multiple job offers across the country. It kind of makes you wonder, how deep do hospitals do research on the people that they hire, right? People can fall through the cracks. And yes, you cannot fake you might be able to fake a degree, which is terrible. Don't ever do that. It's really scary, right? Like, you really have to do your research on the people that you're hiring, especially at a hospital. You're putting people's lives at risk. This is something you should really deep dive, interview people that have worked with them, look into their credentials, look into their backgrounds. I don't know how much they do, I don't know how much they investigate to hire people at these places, but clearly some people can get away with it, which is not great. I'm talking to you, Texas. In May 2011, he signed a very lucrative contract with the Minimally Invasive Spine Institute in North Dallas. He gained hospital privileges at Baylor Regional Medical Center at Plano. And so he and Wendy, they packed up their things and they're like, we're moving to Texas, all right? Totally unaware that this move would set the stage for some of the most horrifying surgical malpractices in American history. So by this point, Duntsch's debts were piling up, and he landed a very big contract with the Minimally Invasive Spine Institute in North Dallas, a $600,000 advance. Not too shabby, right? His exaggerated credentials and a few flat out lies sprinkled in there on his resume helped him even get privileges at Baylor Regional Medical Center at Plano. Early on, he crossed paths with Dr. Randall Kirby. He's a very respected vascular surgeon who'd been doing general surgery in Dallas for over 16 years. Kirby immediately got a bad vibe. Honestly, I love Dr. Kirby. He sounds like a wonderful human being with great morals, and he's just a great person. From what I read, the actions he took in this case, I really admire him for not letting this go and pushing as much as he could, because people's lives were pretty much saved. Probably not in the timeline that we wanted, but it helped prevent any future awful tragedies from occurring. Kirby said, and I quote, "He was an arrogant know-it-all. He walked around like he was the best surgeon in the building, like he was going to revolutionize spine surgery in Dallas, but something felt really off about him." And Kirby was right to be suspicious. The first real warning came with Duntsch's very first patient, a patient named Kenneth Fennell. Fennell went in hoping for relief from chronic back pain. He trusted Duntsch to perform what should have been a routine surgery, but instead, things went horribly wrong. Fennell came out worse than before the surgery, and when Duntsch tried to fix it with a second operation, the damage only got worse, leaving Fennell with serious paralysis in his legs. That is something out of a horror movie, except this is someone's life that actually lived this. So Dr. Kirby and some of the other surgeons, they started noticing a really disturbing pattern. Kirby, after he assisted on one of Duntsch's surgeries, he later described his performance as pathetic. He said he was functioning at the level of a first or second year neurosurgery resident, but without the self-awareness to realize how dangerous he was. And it gets worse. Kirby recalled this one particular alarming incident on a September weekend in 2011. Duntsch was supposed to be taking care of one of his patients, but instead, he was miles away in Vegas, partying while his patient sat unattended. You heard that right. A completely reckless, terrifying display of negligence. And yet somehow he kept getting the green light to operate. I'm just as confused as you are because I couldn't understand that. How do you not have any sort of consequence for that? Even with all the red flags waving in his face, Duntsch just kept going, totally convinced of his own brilliance. What followed next? A string of surgical disasters so shocking that it would change the conversation around medical malpractice forever. The next patient of Duntsch was Lee Passmore. He was a medical investigator. Okay, so this is something that I learned while looking into this and trying to read up all the papers that I could find, was when there is a specialized surgeon, for example, in this case, it's a neurosurgeon, if they're going to go in and commit some sort of operation, you typically tend to have a general surgeon in there with you assisting. It's kind of like you are tag teaming specialists. So a general surgeon will go in there and they're pretty much responsible for like opening up the patient, moving the blood vessels around and the organs aside so that it gives the neurosurgeon access to whatever it is that they need to focus on. And then once the neurosurgeon finishes, the general surgeon will close them up and suture them back up. It's kind of like every person is specialized and focused on one part. Okay, so in walks Dr. Mark Hoyle. He's a seasoned vascular surgeon, and he was assisting and basically responsible for opening up the patient, moving the blood vessels around and the organs aside so that Duntsch could see the lower spine. Once the herniated disc was removed, Hoyle would close and pack up. But as soon as Duntsch started working, Hoyle looked over, and there it was, a massive pool of blood filling up the surgical field. And Duntsch, totally unbothered. He just kept going, and he stated he was working by feel, not by sight. When I read this, I was completely shocked. I would be panicking if a doctor told me they were working by feel and not by sight. You need all your senses in order to understand what you're doing and know what you're doing and look at what you're doing, because you literally have a knife inside me. Like, that is crazy. After this, he announced that he was going to remove something called the posterior longitudinal ligament, one of the spine's two major stabilizers. It's located less than a millimeter away from the spinal canal. Basically, it's a very bad idea. Hoyle had to physically step in and say, we need to talk about this. That's dangerous. Even that attitude is dangerous. And Duntsch finally relented, letting Hoyle take over, stopping the bleeding and cleaning things up. But the damage was already done. Duntsch then put a surgical cage in the disc space that's meant to relieve the nerve pressure whenever you have a herniated disc. But an X-ray later showed that it was placed too far to the left. And so he realized this, that he placed it too far to the left. And when he tried to reposition it, because they actually have to screw it in, when he tried to reposition it, he stripped the screws, making that cage immovable. Passmore was left with chronic pain, and he struggled to walk for the rest of his life. Hoyle called the whole surgery sloppy, and he wasn't wrong. And he was so scarred from that experience that he canceled the remaining operations that he had scheduled with him. And he vowed to never work with him again. Just weeks later, Duntsch operated on his childhood friend, Jerry Summers. I mentioned Jerry earlier. Summers trusted him completely, right? But the surgery was catastrophic. Duntsch severely damaged Summers' vertebral artery. It caused massive bleeding. He tried to stop it with coagulants, but in the process, it created irreversible damage to Jerry's spinal cord. When Jerry woke up, he couldn't move his arms or his legs. He was paralyzed from the neck down. Jerry accused Duntsch of doing Coca-Cola the night before, and because he was desperate, right? Imagine not being able to move from the neck down. When you wake up, you're expecting and hoping for the best, because this is supposed to be someone who is an expert in the field, has been given the green light by the state to be able to cut into me, something that no one else should be able to do, right? So he was desperate. He was hoping that someone would pay attention to what happened, right? But the test ended up coming back clean. However, Baylor Plano still suspended Duntsch for 30 days, but when he returned, he was only allowed to perform minor surgeries under strict supervision. Now, what falls under strict supervision, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know what Baylor Plano agreed to, but according to that, it was minor surgeries only, which, funny enough, well, not funny at all, it's kind of surprising because all of these operations that he has currently done are considered minor surgeries for a neurosurgeon. Fixing a herniated disc should be something that a neurosurgeon, an entry-level neurosurgeon should be able to do, but he's already messing that up. So how do you expect him to still continue on operating and performing minor surgeries when he's already butchered those? I don't know. But during this time, Duntsch started an affair with his assistant, Kimberly Morgan. According to her deposition, they frequently slept together in his office, and he would often drink vodka while doing research after hours. Then comes, and this one, I mean, all of them are awful, but this one really hurt me to read a little more. In comes Kelly Martin. She's a 55-year-old elementary school teacher. She had a herniated disc because she had a little fall from her attic ladder when she was trying to bring down Christmas decorations. Duntsch pretty much recommended something called a macrolaminectomy. It's supposedly routine spinal fusion surgery with minimal risk. But unfortunately for Kelly, she ended up in the hands of a reckless and incompetent surgeon. And well, things didn't go according to plan. From the very start, Duntsch's incisions were all over the place. They were erratic and unnecessarily deep. And then he did the unthinkable. He severed Kelly's left vertebral artery. From that, blood started pooling everywhere. And instead of acting fast, he didn't. He stayed disturbingly calm. And almost like he didn't realize the severity of what he'd done. This was supposed to be a simple procedure, one that shouldn't have taken more than 45 minutes to complete, but 45 minutes passed, then an hour, then 2 hours, and Kelly's husband, Don, he heard nothing. He went into the operating room asking to speak to the doctor because his gut was screaming that something was wrong here. Duntsch came out and he casually said that the operation had gone fine, except for some complications, and that Kelly would have to stay overnight. And she was sent to the ICU. But her body did not cope well with the blood loss. The staff tried to fix the damage, but it was too late and Kelly Martin passed. After her death, Baylor Plano did an internal review. Staff who had seen what happened to Kelly pushed for action. But here's the shocking part. They didn't act immediately. They didn't revoke Duntsch's privileges. Nope. They just let him quietly resign on April 20th. He avoided a formal report that could have stopped him from practicing elsewhere, but that decision allowed him to move on and continue some horrifying pattern at another hospital. Kelly Martin had trusted him with her life, and in return, she became another victim of his deadly incompetence. The scrubs, the white coat, the uniform of a surgeon had become a disguise at this point. It gave him authority in the OR, even as his recklessness destroyed lives. So while Duntsch was hunting for a new job and a new start at another hospital, a doctor who had actually seen what happened at Baylor Plano filed a complaint against him with the Texas Medical Board. Sounds like it should have stopped him, right? Not exactly. That complaint was just one of 6,000 to 8,000 that the board gets every year. When I was looking into this was something that I was completely unaware of, and there has got to be a better system of how the medical board looks into these cases. This is why things fall through the cracks and keep going for as long as they can. I understand that doctors take an oath to help people, to save lives, but that doesn't mean that every doctor is a great doctor. Don't get me wrong. I love the medical community. I love the fact that we have people willing to help others, but these laws and guidelines are definitely put in place to favor the doctor rather than potentially stripping them of their license. So here's the kicker of the Texas Medical Board. They can't start an investigation on their own. They can only act if someone files a written complaint. And the process, let's just say it's painfully slow. And it's basically set up to protect doctors as much as possible. First, the board staff screens every complaint, and they have 45 days just to decide whether to act. Only about 1 in 4 complaints even make it past this stage. So if they decide to move forward, investigators start subpoenaing hospital records. Then those records get sent to a pair of volunteer doctors in the same specialty for review. So if those 2 doctors disagree, a 3rd doctor has to be found to break the tie. Now, these volunteer doctors, they're super busy already, right? And they're making way more money running their own practices than helping the board. So cases get dragged out pretty long. Once the investigation is finally compiled, investigators make a recommendation to the board, but if anything is poorly documented, it can lead to months or even years of expensive legal battles. Bottom line here is board members tend to play it safe, and they push very few cases forward. On average, it takes 9 months just to resolve a complaint, and some drag on for years. And here's the part that's really, really scary. In my opinion, the investigation is confidential until it's finished. So no matter how horrific a doctor's suspected malpractice may be, they can keep practicing freely while the wheels of bureaucracy slowly turn. Now, when Christopher Duntsch resigned from Baylor Plano, he left a trail of horror behind him. But not everyone walked away immediately. Kimberly Morgan, his assistant, and at the time, his mistress, stayed. And what followed was, well, unsettling to say the least. Not long after his resignation, Kimberly got this chilling and bizarre email from him. Here's kind of a little bit of a taste of what he wrote. I feel even gross reciting it because I read the whole email. It was a really, really long email that was just rambling on it. Some of it didn't make sense to me, but it was just gross and icky. And I don't know. This guy He was something else. He had a very high sense of himself. He viewed himself really, I will let you decide. And I quote, "Anyone close to me thinks that I am something between God, Einstein, and the Antichrist. Because how can I do anything I want and come across every discipline, boundary, like it's a playground and never lose?" He went on with, "You, my child." Hold on. He is writing this email to his mistress, and I don't know about you, but I don't like any partner or potential partner to call me my child. That's very weird. Very strange, very gross, very icky. Okay. "You, my child, are the only one between me and the other side. I am ready to leave the love and kindness and goodness and patience that I mix with everything else that I am and become a cold-blooded killer." He claimed he was ready to embrace the very darkest parts of himself. The email was erratic, rambling, and like deeply disturbing. And it was like an unfiltered glimpse of his mind that was kind of spiraling out of control. And so like fearing for her safety, as I think all of us would, because what the fuck was that? Fearing for her safety, Kimberly filed a restraining order against him, obviously. And she later testified that she didn't feel safe around him, and she genuinely feared like what he might do, because this was a turning point. Others began to distance themselves from the man who had once, hidden behind the mask of a brilliant, ambitious surgeon. Now, just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any worse, Christopher Duntsch wasn't done yet, of course. Just weeks after leaving Baylor Plano, he landed a new gig at Dallas Medical Center. The hospital either didn't know or maybe just ignored his horrific past and gave him temporary surgical privileges, and disaster hit almost immediately. Duntsch performed a cervical fusion surgery on a woman named Floella Brown. Now, during the operation, he cut another critical artery, causing a massive stroke. She was later found unresponsive in her hospital room, and staff couldn't get a hold of him for like 90 minutes. She had lost an extreme amount of blood at this point, and she suffered a stroke, and tragically she never regained consciousness and was declared brain dead. The very next day, he was back in the OR with another patient named Mary Eford. This should have been a routine spinal fusion surgery, but it ended up being described as one of the most botched surgeries that the reviewing surgeons had ever seen. Mary woke up in terrible pain, barely able to move her legs. Dr. Henderson, he was a neurosurgeon with over 40 years of experience. He was assigned to fix the damage, right? When he ran a CT scan, what he saw made his jaw drop. The metal spinal fusion hardware that should have been securing her vertebrae was sunk into her lower back muscles, inches from her spine. Henderson discovered that Duntsch had literally amputated a nerve root, and the screws that he did manage to place were either in the wrong spot or screwed into the nerve root that he had already destroyed. Henderson, he really couldn't believe it. He even thought that Duntsch must have been an imposter. There's no way. So he faxed a photo of him to the University of Tennessee Health Science Center to verify that Duntsch had actually graduated. This is how in shock Dr. Henderson was. And the school confirmed he had completed his residency. Desperate, Henderson called the medical board, and their response: "Will you fill out a complaint? We'll probably read it in about 30 days and start an investigation after that." Henderson, he really tried to stress the urgency by saying, "You don't understand. This guy already killed someone. He made another a quad and left my patient partially paralyzed. He needs to be stopped. He shouldn't be operating or making any decisions about treatment or pathology." nothing changed. The only silver lining here, after the Eford surgery, Dr. Corazon Hernandez, CEO of Dallas Medical Center, finally fired Duntsch and reported him to the medical board. But by then, the damage had already been done. Just when you think Christopher Duntsch's career is over, he somehow landed a new position at University General Hospital in Dallas. Despite the growing trail of catastrophic outcomes and complaints, the hospital gave him temporary surgical privileges, either unaware of his past, frankly, or ignoring it. One of his patients there was Jacqueline Troy. She came seeking relief from chronic back pain, and during the surgery, Duntsch severed a nerve root, leaving her with severe nerve damage and partial paralysis. And just like before, he brushed off the complaints, minimizing the pain that she was experiencing. Over the next year, the medical board had received at least 6 more complaints from doctors who had witnessed his work firsthand. Lawyers, surgeons, even board members themselves were begging investigators to do something, right? But the process just kept dragging on. In the summer of 2012, the board finally began to gather enough evidence to consider a temporary suspension. This power had been granted in 2003, and it allows the board to suspend a doctor without a hearing, right? But only if there's enough evidence to prove that they are a continuing threat, right? Luckily, like Duntsch kept proving the pattern. I wouldn't call it luckily, but yeah, the pattern continued in their favor. At least they had some sort of evidence. Now, meanwhile, on the surface, Duntsch was living the fantasy he'd always wanted, right? On healthgrades.com, which is like a website for rating doctors, he had 4.5 out of 5 stars. How? I do not know. I don't know how this works. I don't know who gave him 4 stars, 5 stars, not even 3 stars. I don't know. How could he not just have 0? And then like a slick marketing team like pushed him on local TV. He was trying like every trick of the book to be like the all-star that he could never be, right? Even as his patients kept getting hurt. By December 2012, he performed a cervical fusion at Legacy Surgery Center of Frisco that left his patient with paralyzed vocal cords. Yeah, I didn't understand this one at first either. It is pretty much a complication that's virtually almost unheard of, right? And then in January, a patient at University General woke up paralyzed from the waist down. In May 2013, Dr. Kirby and Dr. Henderson were invited to meet their new neurosurgeon at University General, Christopher Duntsch. Kirby immediately warned the hospital owner, he's bad news. Multiple members have reported him to the med board. The response? Duntsch is only allowed to do minimally invasive surgeries. And Dr. Kirby reminded them that it's precisely the kind of surgery that killed Kelly Martin. Honestly, I love Dr. Henderson and Dr. Kirby. Just 2 weeks later, on June 14th, 2013, Kirby was called in for a recovery surgery of Jeffrey Glidewell. The scene was horrific, to say the least. Saliva and pus were coming out from the wound, and an incision was done completely wrong. And the OR team had to physically restrain Duntsch while Jeffrey lay unattended in the ICU for 2 days. That's horrible. Duntsch even made excuses to the patient's families. He had cut into a vertebral artery and he left a sponge in Jeffrey's throat. What in the flying heck? Like, how does this happen? How have you not seen how almost every single patient is hurt or Later that month, Kirby sent a sworn statement to the medical board listing all of Duntsch's known patients and including reports from other surgeons. His message was clear, and I quote, "The medical board must stop this sociopath Duntsch immediately, or he will continue to maim and kill innocent patients." I don't know how this drags on and on, because after reading about so many of the patients, I don't know how this went on for so long. How do hospitals not look into this? Don't doctors typically have some sort of file of every patient that they worked on? And how could you not see that every patient has had a horrible experience? Finally, the board acted, right? They reviewed case after case, severed arteries, damaged nerves, paralyzed patients, unnecessary deaths, and it was clear this wasn't occasional negligence. It was a relentless, horrifying display of incompetence and disregard for human life. On June 26, 2013, the Texas Medical Board suspended Duntsch's license, citing a continuing threat to the public welfare. By December 6, 2013, his license was officially revoked, a rare and unprecedented action in Texas history. It was a damning acknowledgement that Duntsch had no place in medicine, right? But for many victims and their families, it was too late. The damage was irreversible and for some fatal. Duntsch, stripped of his license, still somehow roamed free, right? A man who has maimed and killed yet escaped the criminal justice system. Like, I don't get it, but with his medical license finally revoked, the legal system started to finally catch up to him. Victims and their families filed numerous civil lawsuits, not just against him, but also against the hospitals that let him operate. Baylor Plano, Dallas Medical Center, and University General Hospital all came under scrutiny for their role for enabling his horrifying spree. But civil lawsuits just weren't enough. Obviously, I wouldn't think that would be enough. The Dallas County District Attorney's Office began working on a criminal case. It's kind of a tricky task, right? Since medical malpractice, no matter how awful it could be, it rarely leads to criminal charges. But prosecutors finally found their angle. Aggravated assault is what they went with. They argued that what Duntsch did in the OR wasn't just negligence or mistakes. It was intentional bodily harm. And the case that really broke it open was Mary Eford, one of his last and most grievously injured patients. By July 2015, Christopher Duntsch was arrested. He was charged with 5 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, 1 count of injury to an elderly individual, and later additional charges for the harm he had caused for other patients. Finally, the law was starting to hold him accountable for the sheer destruction that he left in his wake. Christopher Duntsch's trial finally began in 2017, and the prosecution was led by Assistant District Attorney Michelle Sugar. She laid out the full scope of horrors that he had left behind, patient after patient, surgery after surgery. They painted a picture of a man who either didn't know what he was doing or worse, didn't care. The prosecution even presented Duntsch's surgical instruments. Scalpels, retractors, and surgical hardware were seen as deadly weapons, as they should. Their argument was Duntsch wielded these tools with such reckless disregard for human life that it was no different from a criminal using a gun or a knife. Mary Eford's case became the centerpiece of this trial, and the jury saw images of botched surgeries, botched surgical sites, misplaced hardware, and devastating nerve damage. Expert witnesses testified that Duntsch's actions in the operating room weren't just incompetent, they were criminal. Victims and their families packed the courtroom. They testified about how their lives had been shattered by someone that they had trusted with their bodies. The defense tried to argue that Duntsch was simply an incompetent surgeon, but the evidence was overwhelming. After a 2-week trial, the jury took just a few hours to deliver the verdict. Christopher Duntsch was guilty of injury to an elderly person based on the catastrophic injuries suffered by Mary Eford. In February 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison. Today, Christopher Duntsch sits behind bars. with parole eligibility not until 2045, when he will be over 70 years old. Justice was finally served, but for his victims, the scars will, both physically and emotionally, will never fully heal. And that brings us to today's deep dive, but now I want to hear from you. What do you think about Christopher Duntsch? Was he a reckless monster, a delusional man, or something even darker? And the hospitals that let him keep operating, do they share the blame? How about the Texas Medical Board? Did they act fast enough, or was justice painfully delayed? Is this why so many of us get nervous about visiting a doctor or going into surgery? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing what you think. If you found this video compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next true crime deep dive. Thanks for watching, and stay safe out there.